Hey everybody. So as I mentioned last week, this week's letter is M. Um, since there is quite a few bands for that one, I thought I would split it up a bit. So consi- cons- considering the fact that I am heavy in editing this beast, which is our next book for Northwest Metalworks Music and Books, and as you can see, where is it? Page 119 is how far I've edited. So there's 172 pages, so we're coming along. Still looking pretty good on target for later this summer, having a pre-order ready if we get all the design layout stuff ready to go. We don't like to offer them up before we're in production at least, and it's going to be done very soon. So I'm going to just talk about Metal Church because they have a lot of releases, and they're probably much like Queensryche, one of the biggest metal bands from the Northwest, from Washington. So um, Metal Church was formed originally by Kurt Vanderhoof in late 1980 in San Francisco. He was in the punk band The Lude, which was formed in Seattle. Played a lot of shows up there for about a year or so. He was in the band. They did a single open for the Ramones and played with a bunch of other bands, and did a 7-inch called Kill Yourself, was a 3-song 7-inch. Did pretty well for him. They ended up moving the singer Jay Satz Beret and Kurt and a couple sound people moved to San Francisco. They got Chris Reese on drums, who's later in Bad Religion, I think. Yeah, that seems right. Um, and uh, and another guy on bass. So Kurt switched to guitar. He originally started out on bass, and Kurt's originally an Aberdeen guy, which is where some of the other Metal Church guys are from, the Aberdeen, Hoquiam area. Um, uh, formed, got kind of tired of doing the punk thing, was what he told us, and he formed what was an early version of Metal Church. They lived in an apartment building that they called the church, or a house. I can't remember, was it apartment building or a house? Sorry, I should have looked. How bad am I? But yeah, so they had a place called the Church of Metal, which I think was an apartment building, and some different guys lived there. Doug Piercy of Heathen and um, Anvil Chorus lived there, um, and a couple guys from band Leviathan were in some of the lineups. Kind of went through different members. They had Aaron Zimpel from Leviathan and Anvil Chorus. Piercy was never in a version of Metal Church, but a lot of those guys were friends. He kind of had his own thing sort of happening at the time with some other guys. Um, but a few different people were in the lineups. Kind of nothing really lasted. Like they recorded some instrumental demos. One of the first one, like early '81, with an earlier lineup. Aaron Weiner on drums, Steve Hott on bass, and Rick Condren. I think it was also from Leviathan originally. Was on guitar as well, but they couldn't find a singer. They did some instrumental demos to kind of audition different singers, and gave a copy to Ron Quintana, editor of the magazine Metal Mania and scenester in San Francisco, and he, of course, made copies and shared it with everybody. And so a lot of those demos kind of got around. Merciless Onslaught from the debut album was on that first demo, and they recorded some other songs with William McKay from a band Griffin, who went to form a band Griffin. There's a couple other bands before that on vocals. Um, and Aaron Simple from Anvil Chorus on drums, uh, and they recorded some songs. One of the songs, Red Skies, actually ended up Anvil Chorus also recorded those, and so they put that on. I think it was their debut, um, and so a lot of those lineups just didn't stick together. Kurt got kind of burned out, so he ended up moving back home. Said, could move back in with his mom and probably stay a lot cheaper than San Francisco, I imagine. Um, so he started putting together, getting with some friends. His um, kind of stepbrother wasn't really by blood, but Kirk Arrington, his father Robert dated Kurt's mom for like a decade or so, they said, And so that they actually started jamming together pretty young when they were like around like late junior high kind of range, started having kind of putting some bands together. The going back to that, Tyr was a band who actually did kind of jam and play some dances and stuff. Kurt said the singer of the band was the guy who sang for Hall of Flame later on. So there's a lot of connections there. But when Kurt came back in kind of late 81, early 82 range to Aberdeen, he put together um, kind of a cover band that they ended up calling Shrapnel. And Duke Erickson, who went to Hoquiam High with Kirk Arrington, he joined the band. Kind of went through a couple different people for guitarist. Singer Mike Murphy was in the band for a while. That um, was a local guy as well. And he ended up having a band, Rogues Gallery, that opened for Metal Church at their debut show um, in early May of '84. So, but Metal Church kind of evolved out of the Shrapnel thing. They kind of found the people. Kirk said they used it basically as a training ground to kind of find the right people. Around the time that was happening, Craig Wells had moved to the Kent area and hooked up with David Wayne, who was a Yakima guy originally in some different bands down there. He'd moved up to the Seattle area, and they met supposedly at one of the Battle of Bands at Lake Hills. It sounds like we're not sure which one, but Craig mentioned seeing Myth and Culprit and some of the other bands there at the time, and they connected up. Um, and so the Aberdeen guys ended up coming up and joining up with them, Kurt, and then by then they had a different drummer, Tom Weber, who played in Hall of Flame later on as well. Um, and he played on some demos that they used to audition singers, and they ended up getting Dave Wayne into the band. So this was early '83, kind of around spring area range or so. As everything kind of gelled, Kurt Arrington ended up joining back up with them. I think he was kind of in and out, it sounds like, some different bands he was playing in as well. Um, and then they did their first demos in the late summer of '83. They did a 4-song demo. I do not have that. I have the audio files. I don't have the actual tape though. So, but 4 songs that ended up being on their debut album when that was later released. Um, and or 3 of them, I should say. One was Death Wish, which ended up um, being on this, which was Northwest Metal Fest that I talked about in the last episode about Lipstick. The Metal Church's first appearance was on this. Came out in early May of 1984, and then they did a showcase show at the Moore Theater where Metal Church was the headlining band. I guess by then they were already thinking, the label guys, Jeff and Willie McKay, were thinking that Metal Church would be their full band release, so they wanted to push the band. And so the guys that put out this Northwest Metal Fest, Willie McKay was the owner of Penny Lane Records, and Jeff Gilbert was his manager that worked for him. And so they partnered up to put out this compilation and put on the concert at Moore Theater, and then they signed Metal Church to do their debut album. Right the following month, Metal Church also had a song called The Brave, which is a non-LP track that they also recorded in the early demo sessions, that ended up on this Metal Massacre 5 from Brian Slagle. Slagle had said he had actually tried to get a track from Kurt when he was doing the first Metal Massacre album, because originally he had planned to have Merciful Fate, and that fell through. And he wanted to get a track from Metal Church, so almost could have ended up that Metal Church and Metallica were on the first record in 1982, which would have been one of those earlier lineups. But Kurt didn't feel they were really ready, and they didn't have a recorded thing. It sounds like, so it didn't happen. But he did give him this track that they ended up using, that came out in late May, early June of 1984. It's also had Fate's Warning and Voivod and a bunch of, it's really good compilation. Um, so then Metal Church kind of started building a buzz, started playing shows, San Francisco areas and stuff, and they opened for Slayer in Seattle and Portland in June, I believe, of '84, June July range, and then they went into Steve Lawson Studios to record their debut album with Terry Date engineering it. They released it first on. So there's the debut with the now iconic cover, which was the guitar, the Explorer, the cruciform guitar that was buried in to make it look like it was in a gravestone in the graveyard with all sorts of moss and stuff. Solis Pembe took the shot, and guitar was in EMP for a while as well during their Northwest Passage display. And so this was Ground Zero's first single band release. These are pretty hard to find. I think Willie said they ended up doing in total about maybe 20,000 copies, 20,000 copies, something. But that was quite good for. And then here's the insert that has the famous neck brace, which Kurt actually posted a picture of himself with one of those on recently. There's very few that exist in the world, it sounds like. So that's the original release, pretty hard to find. They got signed to Elektra the following year to a major label deal, and Elektra reissued the first record, and from that time had a early promo shot, which is pretty amusing. The guys actually look like either they have a soft lens or they might even have some makeup on. Pretty short-lived, kind of glammy. You see Dave Wayne with the blonde hair, dyed hair. So it didn't last too long either. So that's kind of funny. Then they followed that up with the second album, The Dark, on Elektra. Came out in 1986, and so they put some money into this. They filmed a video, Watch the Children Pray, which is kind of a sort of a like a heavy ballad that gets pretty heavy, all Fade to Black or something like that, and it got quite a bit of play on MTV. I remember seeing it quite a few times and taped it off the network at the time and stuff. And they started touring a good bit. Got over to New York, played some shows with Anthrax, toured around a bit, played some shows with Metallica, which they ended up touring with them through '87, late '86, early '87. Would have started a bit earlier, but unfortunately Cliff Burton, of course, was killed when Metallica was over in Europe, so they canceled a bunch of dates. I was a little too young to go see them in '84 when they played Portland a couple times, and they skipped it. They were supposed to play with Metallica in '86, and I was going to go, and then they canceled us off the tour. So Spokane and Portland got the cut at the end. So I'm not sure what all happened there. My co-writer Brian Nairn actually got to see him both bands up in Seattle, so I'm kind of jealous of that. But yeah. So then unfortunately they had a bit of some shakeups in the band. Kurt Vanderhoof stepped down from touring with the band after they played. They toured with Metallica over in Europe, and then they opened for Anthrax at the Hammersmith Odeon in the spring of '87, and that was Kurt's last show with them for a while. He stepped down, wanted to still write with the band, which he did, and play on the records. Just didn't want to tour anymore. And so they found a replacement. Mark Baker from Strychnine filled in for a couple tours. He did the '87 tour with Anthrax through the U.S. and stuff. And then they ended up hiring John Marshall, who was James Hetfield's guitar roadie for Metallica. And he also played in some different San Francisco bands, including Blind Illusion. And so John became the permanent guitarist around late '87, and unfortunately they ended up parting ways with David Wayne as well. Dave was a pretty gregarious guy and pretty aggressive at times, and So him and Kurt butted heads, and a couple of the other guys, and somebody else and him butted heads or whatever. So it just kind of, and then there was a lot of drugs and partying going, so stuff happened, and they ended up getting a new singer, Mike Howe. Kurt produced Heretic's full length album. They had a different singer on the first EP, and then they got Mike. He was in a band called Snare that moved out from Detroit and joined Heretic. They did this album. Metal Blade put out this album early 80, late 87, early 88 with Mike singing. Kurt produced it. And then he snatched up Mike to front Metal Church. And so they started in 88 working on a new record. Ended up being Blessing in Disguise, their third album. Had a couple videos off of this, Fake Healer and Badlands, that they had videos that got a lot of MTV play, got some radio play. This actually ended up being their best selling record. The first record between the independent and the Elektra reissue sold, I think, around 200,000 copies, and then they did about 300 or so with the Dark, and then the Blessing in Disguise, Kurt told me they were about 10,000 copies short of a gold record on this, which likely by now, with reissues and things over the years, I'm sure is well over gold. So, but of course never certified. So that record did pretty well for him. Toured quite a bit. That's the first time I got to see him, was on that tour. I saw them with Malaya Rage in Portland at Starry Night, which is now Roseland Theater. So that was a great show. Then, unfortunately, they lost Michael Alago. The A&R guy was the guy that signed Metallica. Also, he signed Metal Church. And when he left the label in '89, left Elektra to go to another label, they had a bunch of changeover in leadership as well, and everybody just kind of dropped Metal Church and just ended up not pushing the record after a bit and stuff, and dropping them from the label, unfortunately. And Concrete management they had by then. Concrete took over about '86, I forgot to mention, and they tried to get him another label. It didn't really work out. Eventually they did get him a deal with Epic, and they did their fourth album, Human Factor. Couldn't think of the name, and I can't read the side of it. Sorry. And so, yeah, so this got some radio play too. Remember a couple of the songs getting some good play, and I think they had a video at least from it. And they did something called Operation Rock and Roll Tour with Alice Cooper and Judas Priest and Motorhead. The other band was Jason McMaster's Dangerous Toys. Cool concept. Unfortunately, by '91, metal kind of lost favor with a lot of the fans and the labels and things, and so the tour didn't do really well. I guess there was some cancels and half crowd turnouts and everything, and they kind of struggled. And Epic dropped them after the one record, unfortunately. And by then they had Kenny Laguna manage them. But Mark Dodson, who'd worked with them on The Dark and also Human Factor, recommended him. And he did real good about with the tour and stuff and working with them. He did some good stuff, but it was kind of a wrong fit. And when they did their fifth record, it was kind of the unfortunate situation of the music scene changing a lot. Laguna brought in Joan Jett and some different people. Jerry Cantrell and Randy Hansen guest on the album. Their fifth album, Hanging in the Balance, which is generally considered to be one of the worst cover art in the not only Metal Church catalog, but in number releases. They got some really weird kind of comic artist or something to do this, and just really bizarre, silly art. Guys hated it, and unfortunately had already paid for it and all that sort of thing. So the labels guys and Kenny insisted on using it and whatever. But record's pretty good, actually. A little more, straightforward metal. They kind of, had lost a little bit of the thrash edge. There's definitely still some in there, but Mike pretty much quit after that record came out. He told me they talked him into doing a European tour, and then he quit, and the band folded for good after that. Early '95, late '94 kind of range. Um, and so people went on to different things. An interesting thing is after Mike joined Metal Church from Heretic, Dave Wayne kind of went down south. He was in the band, the thrash band Intrinsic, for a bit, did some shows with them. I think he recorded a couple demos, but never got released. It was supposed to play Portland and Seattle, I think, but they canceled. I think either they'd already parted ways, or he'd had some vocal problems or something like that, or got sick. So they never played Portland in that. And had a couple different project things that didn't work out with, like Gene Allen from Lizzie Borden and so on. He ended up, kind of interestingly enough, hooking up with the Heretic guys who talked him into joining, and they renamed the band Reverend. So they ended up with a publishing deal and got a deal with Caroline. So they did an EP first, which this is a reissue of the first record, World Won't Miss You. It does also include the 4-song EP from Caroline in '89. And then this record came out in 1990, the World to and a Video Scattered Wits. It got some good MTV play and stuff, I remember at the time. It sounds a lot like Metal Church. So if you're a fan, you'll definitely like the Reverend stuff. They did another record. By then they got signed to Charisma, which is a major label, but it was a label that had like Genesis and Vandergraaf Generator, some prog bands. So they weren't really a metal label. They were trying to kind of branch out, I think. But they did a couple good records with them. The second record they did, the Play God record, 91, this came out. We kind of had a little bit of lineup changes. Ended up with Scott Ian of Anthrax brother Jason Ian on drums, shaved down to a 4-piece. And then around that time, after Metal Church before Metal Church had broken up, Kurt Vanderhoof ended up forming his own band, Hall of Flame. And as I'd mentioned, he had Ron Loud. He went by Ron Loud. It was Ron Soderbergh was the singer. Brian Smith and Tom Weber on drums. They did one record, one CD on IRS Records, which is guaranteed forever. It's kind of an alternative, little bit of country kind of elements, southern rock type vibe, definitely. They got on a tour with ZZ Top that went real well. Replaced the Black Crowes when they bowed out of kind of an East Coast Florida and so on leg. That they did really well. Unfortunately, the CD wasn't out till after, but they did some shows with Blue Oyster Cult, played a bunch of local shows and stuff. Supposedly had some interest from Malago and some other people for a second record, but it just didn't pan out. As I mentioned in the H episode, they did some other demos, which I have a couple demo tapes of Hall of Flame, of some stuff that's unreleased that supposedly Kurt's going to put out at some point, hopefully. And then, so he kind of continued on doing some of his own stuff. He was in a band called Buzzing Room for a short bit, recorded some demos. He said Johnny Wright from Tramp Alley and Bathtub Gin he fronted that band. Then Kurt was in a band with the Dr. Unknown singer for a while. That was kind of a short-lived band to Burn. They played a couple shows. I think it just didn't. Jeff Carell was the singer for Dr. Unknown, didn't really pan out. So he tried to put back a version of Hall of Flame together, which ended up evolving into this with Kirk Arrington on drums, Vanderhoof. And so Vanderhoof's much more of a kind of a classic prog rock band. This is a 2000 reissue. It originally came out in '97, and this was reissued 3 years later with a cover of Deep Purple's Burn. A lot of elements of Kansas and Rush and stuff like that. This would evolve. He did 2 records of Vanderhoof, and this would evolve into this band Presto Ballet, which was his prog rock band. So even while he was still doing a lot of Metal Church stuff as the time went on, he was doing Presto Ballet. And Chuck Campbell, actually, who's in Palooka now, sings on these two, so it's pretty cool. And then, so as it went on, which I can't find my 86 live Metal Church CD, which I've got around here somewhere, that um, I think SPV put out. Yeah, Steamhammer. They had some tapes. Craig, I guess, turned up, Craig Wells, of live in '86, I think, in Texas, and so they ended up getting together and kind of fixing up the tapes. They released that in '98, I believe, and that kind of caused the impetus of what was going to be the original lineup of Metal Church reforming. They ended up doing a record masterpiece and did a European tour and played some festivals. Unfortunately, split up before it kind of fell apart before they never played any U.S. shows on this tour, sadly. And it didn't end up being Craig, ended up declining, joining the band, and they got John Marshall back. But then by the time they did the tour, Kirk Arrington and Duke had played on the record, but they couldn't. Kirk had health issues with diabetes and stuff. They got Jeff Wade from Juggernaut to play drums. Guy Brian Lake filled in for bass with Duke because he couldn't afford to quit his job and go touring and stuff. So it kind of ended up being a little less than expectations. The CD's pretty good, actually, though, in my opinion. And then I don't have the Wayne record, but Dave Wayne did a record, credited Craig Wells, who didn't play on the record. It's actually pretty good. It's Jimmy Bell from Autograph and a few other bands on guitar. I forgot the drummer, but it's pretty solid, actually. And they do a cover of Mississippi Queen, which was actually something Metal Church covered back in '86 for the intention of possibly using it on the Dark, but it never got included, but it does exist. And so he kind of did his own thing with the Wayne thing, which didn't make anybody too happy. And then he also had been working. He'd kind of had a different. Dave had a couple different. Had moved back up to Yakima in '93, late '92, early '93. Did a Reverend lineup of his own. Then they recorded some demos and played some shows. Bill Rhines and a couple other guys were in the band. And then Todd Stotts, who was in Sire, and Gangland joined on drums when Dave relocated back up to the Seattle area. They had eventually John Stallman and Chris Nelson from Faustus joined on bass and guitar, respectively. They did record some demos. They ended up self-releasing this, but it had some distro and release overseas. Gathering of Demons, a 4-song EP. This is actually a reissue one from a couple years back from Vic Records, where it has a remix of the 4 tracks, the original 4 tracks, a couple live versions, a cover of UFO's Lights Out, and Dave Wayne doing some different takes and goofing around in the studio and stuff. It's pretty cool. And then recently, this just came out, was Night of the Vinyl Dead Records did this over in Europe, was a reissue of Gathering of Demons on vinyl, which has new mixes of the new remixes, which sound really good, actually. Of the 4 original tracks, the Lights Out cover, the 2 live tracks, and the Dave Wayne studio excerpts. And this one's actually signed by the 3 out of 4 guys. Of course, Dave Wayne passed away, sadly, in 2005. And so this is kind of cool. We have some of these for sale, actually, helping the Reverend guys out, distributing some of them. So if you want one, drop me a line or go to our website, northwestmetalworks.com. And then Kurt ended up putting back a new lineup of Metal Church with Kirk Arrington. They got Jay Reynolds of Malice on guitar. Steve Unger, who was a local Tacoma area guy in some different bands back in the day. He joined on bass, and Ronnie Monroe's in Far Cry and Paladin and stuff. He joined on vocals. And so they did Weight of the World, 2003, I believe. Yeah, that seems right. And this was pretty much hailed as kind of a comeback. Pretty good record. They started touring again and stuff. Um, did Light in the Dark, which was, and they actually have a new version of Watch the Children Pray they did with a nice little tribute to Dave Wayne when he passed. This came out in 2006. Can't find my copy of Present Wasteland either, somewhere around here. So they did that record next. Then the band split up. Ronnie Monroe was doing some solo stuff, and here's one of his solo CDs. And this actually has so Rat Pack put a couple of his solo releases out. This has Rick Van Zant um, from Rottweiler and Snowblind, and then of course Rick would join Metal Church for the Present Wasteland record, replacing Jay Reynolds when he left. This also has Mike Wilton from Queensryche doing a couple guitar solos, Rick Pierce from Q5. I think even Izzy Rahame plays on it as well from Rottweiler. And then, so Ronnie had kind of a solo thing going. He had some other project offered stuff. So he ended up, and then Kirk had some back problems and stuff. So they ended up kind of folding Metal Church at that point, splitting up. And then they came back and did a new record in 2013. They had an offer to play the 70,000 Tons of Metal, which kind of spurred it on. Originally, Jay Reynolds, he played in the 70,000 Tons of Metal, was going to play with him back in the band, but he couldn't do it. He had Malice reunion stuff was going on. They were going to do another record. And so Rick Van Zant came back. They did this, and then Ronnie ended up quitting for good. And it kind of looked like the band was going to be done. And so Kurt said that he was going to pretty much hang it up, and he had reconnected with Mike Howe. They were looking at maybe doing a project with Nigel Glocker, from Saxon, who'd contacted him, I guess was the impetus. And Mike Howe ended up rejoining Metal Church. And so they did 11, 2016. Saw him, they toured with Armored Saint for like a West Coast, sort of Midwest, I think maybe tour. Saw him in Seattle. They also played Portland. I was able to interview Kurt, Mike, and Rick Van Zant backstage before this show, which was really cool. They were great live. Mike sounded phenomenal. Another record a couple years later, Damned If You Do, and actually had a lot of success with 11. I must mention that this actually charted like 40 something on the Billboard chart. Did really well. Sold a lot of copies for an independent. And then they did From the Vault, which was some new material, some unreleased tracks. They do some cool covers of like Green Eyed Lady, from Sugarloaf, Nazareth, Don't Judas Me. So, and then there's some live stuff. And then sadly, Mike died the following year. And then it kind of looked like they were done. But ended up that they're coming back. This year they've announced they've, new album, new tour, starting to play, announce a bunch of festivals and stuff. Mark Jacobs is the new singer, who was with Ross the Boss's band, the Manowar guitarist. And then out later this month, next week actually, is the new record. So yeah, there you go. So there's a history of Metal Church. They're continuing on. Like I said, we have a bio book, cooperation from all the members. In fact, actually went down and even interviewed Kurt again down in Palm Springs last November. All the guys pretty much talked to everybody. We didn't necessarily get new interviews with a couple of the guys, just didn't work out, but we had a lot of existing interview material, including some recent stuff. So we were fortunate to use quite a bit of stuff, get quite a bit of interviews ourselves. So I think we're going to tell a pretty complete story. So, yeah, like I said, look, late summer, we're hoping to drop it probably like August range for pre-orders and have it out maybe like October or so. So there you go. So next week, I'll continue back on with M on a whole bunch of other bands, but I wanted to do a little focus on Metal Church this week. So there you have it.